But that's at the place.
Hey, Tom. It's Price.
Because that happened to me one time. And I finally see down here, you've got video, but if you don't have your camera, you can't
Okay.
get in there. So you have to go to settings. Well, don't have.
More often than I like, actually, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Tom Coates, and welcome to the Richmond, Central Virginia. Are we on? Okay, do I need to start again? Okay. Welcome to the Richmond, Central Virginia Ions Community Group. This is our 26th anniversary program. We first got underway with this group in January 1996 and have been meeting one way or another every month since then. When the pandemic came along, we had to go to Zoom only, and as of last May, we resumed meeting in person in combination with Zoom. So we welcome those who are here in person and also those who are joining us in Zoom land to participate in our meeting. As many of you know, IONS stands for the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It's a 501c3 organization that was established in 1973 by Edgar Mitchell, who was the Apollo astronaut, the lunar landing module pilot for Apollo 14. And like several of those fellows who walked on the moon in the Apollo program, he had a profound takeaway from the experience, mainly from his seeing the Earth from 250,000 miles away as he was on his way home. He had a unity consciousness experience which advised him or guided him to want to spend the rest of his life exploring the frontiers of consciousness, especially the interface between science and spirit. He established, with the help of a significant donor, IONS as a result of that, and left the space program. And it is headquartered in Petaluma, California. As a result of the pandemic, it has gone live on Zoom with many programs that it did not have before. And they usually run on Friday afternoon every week, and then various other programs that are announced on their website. So it is not necessary for those who participate in our group to be members of IONS at large, but we do encourage it because they have some wonderful programs, and it's the banner under which we've operated all these years. All you need to do to be a member of our group is just showing up at our meetings, either in person or online, and we welcome any and all. There are no entrance requirements and no financial requirements, although we do pass a basket at the meetings for love offerings, which we need in some amount to pay rent and so forth. And so we encourage that when that basket comes around, for each and all of you to dig into the deepest recesses of your pocket and your heart in order to help us keep going. And also for those of you who are participating online, you can go to our website and you can make a donation through PayPal using any credit card and so forth to do that. Or if you don't want to, if you're not technologically savvy enough for that, which I'm one of those who is not, you can always send a check if you prefer, and just mail it to the address that's on the transmittal email that I send out every month. with payable ions in whatever amount you want to donate. We welcome any and all amounts. I'd like to give thanks also to our steering committee and our group, which is myself, Elizabeth Kuhn, who is our webmeister, Sally Youngs, who is our treasurer, Bonnie Cairo Justin, and Martha Mullen, and Carol Louie. I will say that we had an especially poignant meeting this past Monday of our steering committee when the building that my office is in caught fire while we were in the meeting. And we were very fortunate to be there so we could call in the fire and also make the floor available to the fire department. The building's been closed. It was not, fortunately, in my office space, but it was in the space below. And the building's been closed all week as a result of smoke damage and all that sort of thing. So, but knock on wood, it could have been a whole lot worse than it was, and we're very thankful that it was as relatively minor as it turned out to be. Bonnie, you have any more announcements we need to make? No. Okay.
Just making sure that thank you to everyone who showed up.
Right. I would like to invite Martha Mullen to give the opening meditation. Our speaker has arrived, so we were waiting for him because he was running a couple of minutes late, and so after that we'll introduce the speaker and move on. Thank you, Martha.
Good morning.
Morning.
What I would like you to do is, eyes open or closed, think for a minute about all of the prevalent polarities in our experience. Think about Republican versus Democrat versus Libertarian. Think about black versus white. Think about vaccinated versus unvaccinated, masked versus unmasked. There's tons of polarities out there right now, which I think has to do with our spiritual state and ascension. And so I just want you to hold that in your heart right now. Hold the polarities in your heart, because all is one. And I want to read this from Corinthians. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but I do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I might boast, but I have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will cease. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we only know in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know in full, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And then I would like to read some midwinter thoughts. Perhaps the miraculous truth is simple, just this, that in spite of our hesitancy to trust, to reach out and to love because of our own wounds, heedless mistakes, and cruel or careless knee-jerk injuries to others, that we reach out anyway. We unclench and open up a little or a lot, depending upon how feral our hearts are, and we begin incrementally to love another. Perhaps, like a wild stray, we snatch the proffered food and run off into the woods. Yet we watch and wait, secretly longing for more tidbits. We learn to trust the giver. We choose to draw near, to open our hearts. Soon we ourselves serve another, and recognizing wounds similar to our own, we understand, and with deep, wild compassion we forgive another, and thus we ourselves are slowly healed. We are forgiven. Like watching a wound heal after surgery over weeks and months, we too eventually become whole. We are renewed and resurrected. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Martha. I think that letter of Paul from 1 Corinthians is probably everybody's, one of their favorite passages from the New Testament. You've often heard me say at this podium that we believe the programs we put on in the Richmond Ions Community Group are just about as good as they get anywhere in the world. The program we have today is in the same category as that. The speaker, Ben Campbell, is somebody that I first met, I think in the late 60s, either just before or just after I was married to my first wife. He was at that time married to his first wife, and was a young Episcopal priest in the area of Whitestone, Virginia, and we didn't spend a lot of time together, but we were kind of instant friends, and we stayed acquaintances through the years, although we have not stayed in close contact. We got together recently, and I think Ben was surprised that our paths had been in many ways so similar. He has pursued the cause of human equality and equity and so forth very, very persistently and from a religious perspective. I pursued that as a lawyer doing civil rights practice. I haven't dedicated the time in recent years to it that I did as a younger lawyer, but I resolved my most recent civil rights case as of Wednesday of this week. And so it's still a passion of mine that I've never given up on. Ben Campbell wrote a book that he published in 2013 called Richmond's Unhealed History. It is one of the finest books, if those of you who have not read it, it's one of the finest books you'll ever read about the role of this area in the racial inequality and the culture of inequality that has been dominant in America since 1619. And the fact that Richmond energetically has been a capital of that. It's been an emblem of that. It's been an icon for that. And because of that, and because Richmond, as you've heard me say before, is also, and this is something that Ben might not be as aware of as some of us woo-woo people in this group, it is an energetic vortex. So things that go on here, for better or worse, will have a greater and grander impact than they might if they went on somewhere else. And so what the situation we have created here is that the impact that the Richmond history has had has been disproportionately great in terms of its influence around the country and perhaps around the world. And by the same token, we have the potential for that impact to be transformed into something positive that could be disproportionately great in terms of its positive impact on humanity and on the whole concept of racial equity and equality of opportunity for all citizens of all races of every kind. And so Ben has been an advocate for that. He's got an incredibly illustrious resume. He founded or co-founded, I think he won't take sole credit, the Richmond Hill Retreat Center over on Church Hill, and was its pastor for years and years. He now, of all things, is chairman of the board of the Greater Richmond Transit Authority, which is an unlikely position for an Episcopal priest, but there it is. And so, again, he's been an activist in all kinds of wonderful ways throughout the years and been a constant force for good. He's what, 80 years old, 81 now? Is that right?
I think so.
Something like that. We would like to keep him young because we need his influence to continue for a lot longer than actuarial tables will tell you it might. So without further ado, I give you Ben Campbell.
Thank you. You got me on, I think, didn't you? And you said you had me muted. Yeah, it's on. Yeah. So unmute me, right? Good. All right. Okay. So I don't need that, right? You're gonna kill that? Yeah. All right, good. All right, so hello. Sorry I'm late. There was another meeting this morning that I also left early, so there we are. Can we have that first slide? Yeah, good. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm fascinated by Richmond history. My background is political economy and theology, but I think I got involved in history of Richmond because that's Richmond's history, but it's poorly done history. The stunning thing about Richmond history is how it's basically, it reminds me of the Soviet Union in the mid-50s, where basically you constructed a myth that covered everything and you never really had to go into the depth. And this particular history that we lived in Richmond, which we seem to be obsessed about, is basically covering an untold reality which would be much more creative and productive should we know it, because then we'd know what we're dealing with. And so I think when I got here, felt in some ways like I was coming into the belly of the beast. Yeah, I'm a native Virginian, a 7th generation. My grandfather, my great-grandfather taught at Washington College before the Civil War and was there when Lee came to be president. My dad was a civil rights attorney coming out of Lexington and W&L. And I lived in Arlington, and we went through all this craziness around race growing up in a segregated society, but Richmond was where everything was being run from. It was very clear. And as I came down here, dated a girl who lived on Patterson Avenue and tried to encounter this place. Then the bishop sent me here in 1970. And so I became involved with the city and deeply puzzled at what seemed to be a static, an unmoving situation. A place that seemed trapped in time. And I'll begin to look at that. So I've been working on this, since I got here. So I'm constantly looking up new things, and I'm fascinated by what it did. But anyway, here I'm going to tell you 7 stories over 4 centuries. So we're dealing with 4 centuries here, as you know. We're dealing basically now, understand, we're dealing with 7 7/8 of the history of Virginia is history in which specific racial inequity is prescribed by law. 7/8 of the history. This last 53 years, I dated from 1970, 52 years, is 1/8 of our time. When we've taken the nominal discrimination and inequity out of law. But 7/8 of it is straight and intentional. So, you know, there's no sense playing around with guilt here. It's a question of just looking at fact, because the guys that designed this stuff didn't feel guilty about it. They did it. And, you know, some of them are all of our ancestors, or if they're not, they're our spiritual ancestors. So summer of 1619, you all know that the White Lion comes over to Virginia. It's a pirate ship, a privateer. It has been kind of going around the Caribbean trying to get hold of Portuguese and Spanish vessels that have wealth in them. It is flying under a Dutch flag, although it's an English ship, because the English don't want to be held accountable for the piracy they're doing. But basically, it's just a license. He's just a privateer. He's given license by the Dutch. So he and another ship named the Treasurer, which is a very famous ship because it was the ship that belonged to the pirate who was the Admiral of Jamestown in 1613 and governor in 1618, named Samuel Argall. I mean, these guys were not cool. I mean, Christopher Newport was a pirate too, by the way. He was. I mean, that's how he made his money. All right. So the White Lion and the Treasurer hit a Portuguese slaver called San Juan Baptiste, I think it's something like that, in the Caribbean on its way to take Angolans to the Spaniards and sell them. San Juan Baptiste had taken more than 300 people from Angola, and only 200 were still alive. It's a horrible, horrible ship. And they thought it was a treasure ship, so they stop it. There's no treasure there. There's just desolate Africans. And they don't want to have this piracy be without compensation, so they take some of these Africans off the ship, put them on the Treasurer and the White Lion, and they sail off. But unfortunately, they don't have any food. So the White Lion stops in at Point Comfort. According to John Rolfe, who was the secretary of the colony in 1619, this is about August of 1619, it is just after the first English governing body in the New World has met, not the first governing body in the New World, but the first English governing body in the New World has met. He sells the enslaved persons to the governor of the colony. These guys are something. For food. And then that ship leaves. The Treasurer puts in about 3 days later, and the Treasurer is also flying under a false flag of some country that no longer exists. They're hesitant to take the enslaved people off the Treasurer because they're beginning to wonder about whether the Queen is going to, or whoever it is, the Royal House of England is going to approve of this. So they take 3 or 4 more, maybe 31 Africans come to Virginia at that point in time and are put out into the fields. Now, what they don't tell you is that in the 3 months before this August landing, there are 650 boys from England dumped on the shore of Virginia and sold as persons for general use. That's the phrase that's used. So we got 650 impoverished boys captured, tricked, drugged, brought off the streets of London into taking care of King James's unemployment, brought into Virginia and we got 31 Africans. And that's basically what's going on in 1619. So that is basically the framework of early Virginia. These people are on indentures, which is a nice word because in fact it's a 7-year indenture. You can be bought and sold. You have no rights during that period of time, and nobody survives 7 years. So basically this is white slavery. It occurs till about 1660 in Virginia in a very, excuse me, very kind of firm situation. And it sets up.
Many times those indentures will continue for multiple terms.
If you did anything wrong, they added years to them. Yeah, it really until 1660, this is just slavery. It begins about 1660 for some of these people to survive their indentures. Some people begin to get land as tenant farmers. But until that time, and actually up through the 1600s. Now, 1676, you've heard of Bacon's Rebellion. You know, the difference between a rebellion and a revolution is what?
Revolution wins.
Revolution wins, exactly. Okay. So I just want you to see what happens in 1619. This is really critical because what it does is set up the American class structure, which includes the great men who are getting 50 acres of land from the king for every one of these white boys they bring in.
Huh.
Hey, look at it. And if they die in the first year, you get their 50 acres and you bring another one in. So that's how these great plantations get built. All right, I'm going to jump to 1605. Thank you so much. And 1605, we have an event which I call the invention of the white race. It's not an original name. It comes from a guy named White who wrote a 2-volume history on this. And we have the Virginia Slave Code. It was written in 1705. It's in October of 1705. It's available on the web. If you look at Henning Statutes at Large, October 1705, you'll read 20 pages of it. It consolidates the laws that have been developed from about 1640 on in Virginia and really reach a peak in 1680. Why do they reach a peak in 1680 and then get consolidated in 1705? The reason is there's a rebellion in 1676. A man named Bacon has a rebellion. First he goes after Indians, then he goes after the governor, chases him out of Jamestown to the eastern shore. Bacon, by the way, had some property over where Gilpin Court is. Bacon's quarter branch is there. He also owned Curl's Neck, going down Route 5. But Bacon dies of the bloody flux, whatever that is, and his troops are forced to surrender at West Point. And when they surrender, the troops that surrender are half black and half white. Indentured, enslaved. The word Negro slave has begun to appear in Virginia law at that point. And the suggestion that a child born of a Negro woman is a slave, who is enslaved is a slave for life, has begun to appear in Virginia law. That was not true in 1619. No. But there's 400 of each, black and white people. Now, y'all probably know this, but that scared the padookie out of the folks who ran the state.
Right back a little bit.
Because the worst thing that could happen would be a combination of all of these working class, labor, enslaved servants working together to overthrow the great men. And of course, it had already happened. We had had 2 or 3 major white servant rebellions up until that point. And in 1682 or so, we had some with black and white servants together. So what do the great men do? They get together, of course, which they're always doing. By the way, the House of Burgesses is not what you and I would call a democratic institution. It's like the Magna Carta. I mean, these are the nobles getting together, telling the king that he's got to include the nobles. But that's about the level of inclusion that's present. So it's the great men in every county getting together. And we met on the Northern Neck. I mean, it's so helpful for me to have lived there to understand how this is. So they get together to create the Virginia Slave Code, and they make a very critical distinction in law between the privileges that are accorded to a Negro slave, and there basically are none. And they use the phrase Negro slave. And the privileges that are accorded to a white Christian servant. And the two in fact, the title of this section of the Virginia Code is Of Servants and Slaves. They're making a distinction of privilege between the two. And that's white privilege. It's just basically, it's the privilege for white. And the reason why is white used? Well, up until this point, Christian was the word used as an ethnic identifier. And you'll find it, of course, it starts in Europe in the 1400s or so. Some very interesting history about relationships to Africa in the period from 1400 up until this period of Atlantic settlement. But the Christian is no longer an effective identifier because a bunch of the enslaved people are getting baptized. So they have to have a different. Now, in the Negro slave category, they include Muslims. I think they include Jews. Indians are in there. It's never against the law to kill an Indian until about 1680 in Virginia. It's pretty racist place. And it's set up that way naively. I mean, almost. People are not questioning it. They're setting this up in this fashion and making these racial distinctions. So, white Christian servant, 1705. And the word white is used. Actually, the white first appears in the Maryland Code around 1692. August 1800, y'all know what happened, I assume, in August of 1800 on the 30th. We just about had another rebellion from Gabriel and his colleagues. He attempted to complete the American Revolution. Imagine that. One of his buddies who was captured and hanged, there were 25 of them captured and hanged, had a flag in his pocket that said "Death or Liberty." You know, maybe he was the guy lighting candles at St. John's in 1775. I don't know. They wouldn't have known that he was there and wouldn't have thought that he'd be thinking about this. So Gabriel tries a revolution. It fails because there's a thunderstorm. And he gets down to Norfolk, but he's captured and hanged at 15th and Broad. Hanged at the burial ground where the Negro burial ground in Richmond has in it the scaffold. So when you go to bury grandma, the scaffold's right there. He and the other 25 who are hanged in courthouses, out in public, so every black person in the state will know what a terrorist state this is. And this is a tough place. And you got to know that if you step out of line, you'd be lucky if you just get whipped. And that's the nature of Virginia in 1800. It's very clear. Why are they so upset? Well, guess what happened in Santo Domingo, in Haiti in 1792? The enslaved people jumped up and threw out the white French colons, and by 1802 had established a separate country. A bunch of those French white people came to Hampton, Richmond, and Petersburg with their enslaved people. And what do you think those enslaved people did when they got to Richmond, Hampton, and Petersburg? Well, John Adams actually supported the revolution in San Domingo. He thought it was good. He thought it went along with these ideals that they'd been stating. But Thomas Jefferson didn't. When he became president, he got rid of the ambassador. He cut off the commerce and actually tried to support a French fight to take the island back. So this stuff is going on all the time. The thing that I've learned in my last reading and work over the last 2 or 3 years, and I wish I could think of the name of this last book I read by a Times reporter who's black, who married a Ghanaian woman and has done some really good work on the African stuff, is that in the period from about 1500 to 1700, the world looks like the Atlantic Rim. Africa, Europe, the islands, the edge of South America, and the edge of North America. So people who are living here are not looking west. They're looking east. The whole, and the commerce, 50% of the American commerce, for example, is supporting, in 1700, 50% of American commerce is supplying goods and services to Barbados and the other islands that are sugar islands, because using enslaved Africans, so much money is being made from the sale of the development of sugar that they don't want to take any of their economy for foodstuffs and garments and stuff. They want to use the money they're getting from the sugar to buy it. And so America is dealing with the Caribbean the whole time. America's half revolution, November 1841. These are just dates along the way. November 1841. There's a ship that leaves the dock down at probably Rockets, maybe Manchester docks, but I think it's probably this side of the river. It's got about 90 or 100 enslaved Africans on it. Most of them have come from Lumpkin's slave jail, which we'll discuss again later. Robert Lumpkin brings them down there. It goes down to Hampton. It picks up past John Tyler's plantation, by the way. He's president at the time, I think. They pick up another 30 or so people in Hampton, and they head out around down south around the Outer Banks. And sometime around that time, a guy named Madison Washington and 10 others take over the ship, killing one of the crew and keeping the rest of the crew alive because they don't know how to sail the ship. And they said they wanted to go to Africa, but the crew persuaded them they didn't have the foodstuffs or ability to get there, so they went to Nassau. And they say, I love this story. The ship is called the Creole. So they sail into the harbor in Nassau. And what happens is all the locals get in their boats and surround the ship. All the military, it's an English colony, but all the military are black with white officers. And basically, there's a standoff because nobody in the Bahamian army is going to capture these people. It's really lovely. They finally reach an agreement that 9 or 10 ringleaders go to jail, everybody else is freed, and then the 9 or 10 ringleaders are freed. And eventually, the Creole goes on down to New Orleans, which is where all these things were going, because the slave trade, downriver slave trade, went from Richmond to New Orleans. Eventually, Daniel Webster goes to England to negotiate the Webster-Ashburton Treaty to pay off the owners of these people for having lost their slaves, making the British pay the Americans damage for that. How do you like that case? Isn't that cool? Yeah. All right. So, But what that does is it reveals, and Frederick Douglass writes a book about this guy. The Congress has these enormous hearings on the story of the Creole. What this does is open up a window on the downriver slave trade, which is basically not talked about and is absolutely enormous. Far greater than the African slave trade was a couple of centuries before. And we'll go back to that in a second. June 1902, that's the Virginia Constitutional Convention. So following the Civil War, there's a scramble, not known exactly what's going to happen in terms of freed slaves and how we're going to deal with the 14th and 15th Amendment. And actually in Virginia from 1881 to 85, there's an interracial government. The Republicans and the black folks actually get a majority vote. They elect a governor. They have conventions that are big and interracial in First African Baptist Church, which is still standing. That building is at the corner of College Street and Broad, right above the interstate. But in 1885, the Democrats putting together a bunch of heavy racist stuff, including a phony race riot in Danville and some other stuff, succeed in overthrowing the brief black majority. Does this sound familiar to anyone? And in 1902, 1901 and 1902, we have a convention to get ourselves a new constitution, because there had been a fairly liberal one called the Underwood Constitution right after the Civil War. We get ourselves a new constitution, which is deliberately attempting to write into law as much racial discrimination as possible. There's a couple of quotes. There's a great quote from Carter Glass, you know, later a major national figure, a senator from Virginia from Lynchburg, saying that what they're trying to do is to figure out how to discriminate as legally as possible. John Good, who actually had been Solicitor General of the United States, he was from Bedford. He was the head of the convention. This is a quote from him. Congress not only committed a stupendous blunder, but a crime against civilization and Christianity, when against the advice of their wisest leaders, they required the people of Virginia and the South, under the rule of bayonet, to submit to universal Negro suffrage. That's the head of this convention, 1902. Let me read it again. It's an incredible line. Congress not only committed a stupendous blunder, but a crime against civilization and Christianity when, against the advice of their wisest leaders, they required the people of Virginia and the South, under the rule of bayonet, to submit to universal Negro suffrage. So now racial segregation was never intended to be a program of equity. It was a program of inequity, deliberate. It was structured inequity. And structured inequity was Virginia. I mean, that has been the principle in Virginia from the beginning, is structured inequity. That certain people distinguished by race shall be property rather than own property. The big barrier to, the big stated barrier to freedom of black people in the 1800s was they couldn't have, there wasn't any property available for them. All the property taken from the Indians had been distributed to white people. But they also didn't work on property in the new western areas that they were now taking from Indians either. In fact, the only property they were considering to give to Africans, as you know, was property in West Africa, in Liberia, which was a program designed by Monroe, you know, Governor of Virginia, then President of the United States, supported by the Virginians in particular, and actually pretty much run by people out of Petersburg. It's black folks who went to Africa to get that thing going. All right, March 1970. You know, this is kind of where we come in, and it's really, there's the stuff that happens in this period between 1970 and 1972 is immensely important for the moment. Hard to fully understand, but as I take 1969 as the end of legal race discrimination in Virginia, and that's because of the New Kent decision in the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court in 1969, there was a decision in the New Kent case, and what New Kent had done was New Kent, small county, still just has 10,000 people. All right, so, but New Kent had maintained a dual school system. Black schools, white schools. They didn't need two schools for high school or middle school or elementary school, but they had them. And then they were letting a trickle of black students go to their white schools. And what the Supreme Court said in the New Kent decision was the maintenance of a dual school system is a prima facie case for the fact that you guys do not intend to abolish racial segregation in education, even if a few folks trickle across the line. And that decision basically said you no longer can have a racially segregated set of facilities. Big important decision. What happens, of course, is you know about Marriage's decision in Richmond, where we have crosstown busing, which integrates the entire system, where every school has to have an equal have in its membership the same percentage of black students and white students that exist in the system as a whole. You know about Linwood Holton's insistence that his children go to Mosby and Kennedy and Churchill. Marvel Linwood died several weeks ago, and we remembered that time. And then there is the case where we seek to consolidate the school systems of Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfield so that we can have proper racial integration. And that case is fought by the state of Virginia as well as the surrounding counties. So it's the policy of the state of Virginia was to maintain racial segregation in the new form. And that's the critical moment. This is also the moment that we see in the case that Tom worked on with Curtis Holt, which fascinating case, which dealt with the annexation of Chesterfield County and whether or not Richmond would be able to annex. The General Assembly in 1970 decided that Richmond would never be able to annex any more territory. Well, actually, they called it a temporary moratorium, but it's been temporary ever since. And the law applied only to Richmond, by the way. I mean, it was for cities over 125,000, but nobody else was able or wanted to annex. It was only Richmond. So what happens is, in 1970, discrimination that has been overtly racial is replaced by another form of discrimination which cannot be stated as racial. But everybody knew what was going on, and that's what was stated in the General Assembly, was that these independent cities in Virginia, and particularly Richmond, would now be the black place, and the surrounding counties would be the white place. That was intended. It was certainly true in the school system in 1970, and in many ways continues today, and we can discuss how that's true. So what you have is an invention of a series of replacement strategies that no longer overtly state what has been true for the previous 18 generations. It's just been 2 generations since this was done, so 18 before that. Certain people distinguished by race shall be property rather than own property. Interesting question there. What is since home ownership has been a significant racial issue, as you know, through redlining and also just income, basically, who can afford to rent, who can afford to own. So you move from being property, not to owning property, but to having enough wage to barely pay a rent. $45,000 is the median household income in the city of Richmond, and that barely rents an apartment in terms of the capacity of the income. So that's where we are at that moment. And finally, February 2006, to understand, Virginia tried to recreate segregation using jurisdictions. It has changed some in the last 50 years, but they did try to recreate racial segregation. They maintained basically what I would call a structure of privilege, where the privileged class, when the privileged class is allowed to hoard wealth as opposed to distribute wealth. So basically, we've got a tax system where the real estate taxes on the wealthy are lower than the real estate taxes on the poor, and the needs of the poor are higher than the needs of the wealthy. And that's what goes on in public education. Horribly. We need twice as much money per child at Armstrong as we do at Deep Run, and Deep Run has twice the resources. And that's the system the state created and advocated for in the 1970s. February 2006. Can you pull me in now? No, I want to move to the next slide. I don't want to be able to move. I want to be able to move. Will I get you to do the moving? Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, give me liberty or give me death. And I'm assuming you all know, but this is the original church right here, this building. So that was the front door, and that was the building. And that's the largest building in Richmond in 1775. You know, there's only about 600 people living here. So that's why they met there. Okay, next. That's give me liberty or give me death. Next slide, please. This is all men are created equal. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson. This is Maison Carré. He got the thing to be built. He'd written the Declaration of Independence. By the way, check out that language, all men are created equal. What he's really doing is saying to the former servant class, you guys get some rights too, and I need you to fight my revolution for me. It's an inclusion of the poorer white people. It's giving them status. But he has no intention of including black people in that. I don't think that's really not there. George Wythe did. He's the one guy, but George Wythe dies in 1609, so 1607? 1809, yeah, all right. Okay, next. So here you all know these people, but they're meeting in Richmond. The Constitution is ratified in Richmond in 1788. The same people have been up in Philadelphia come down here and start arguing about it. And these guys are brilliant. I mean, there's no question. If you look at the list. So there's George Wythe. He's the law professor at UVA who becomes a judge in Richmond. William and Mary becomes a judge in Richmond and eventually is murdered. It's crazy. He's murdered by a white stepson. And the black woman who lives with him, and there's a free black man living with them too. The black woman has seen the poison put in the Wythe's glass by the white guy, but the black woman can't testify in court because a black person can't testify in court. And that comes from the slave codes, way back then. That's still in place. And Wythe is the only guy in his court decisions who actually says, we're talking about, you got to prove that a person should be given unequal rights because it's in the nature of humanity that people are equal. He taught that to Jefferson. I don't know why Jefferson didn't learn it. He picked up. So here are the guys, Harrison, William Henry Harrison became president. His father was in this convention. Tyler became president. His father was in this convention. Edmund Randolph was here. All the guys, Patrick Henry just spouted off constantly. James Monroe was here. They were all right there where the monumental church is. There was an old French school there. There was a wooden building that eventually burned down. And they met and had this convention. And they were brilliant. And they really studied government. And they loved reading the Greek and Roman folks. And, they had free time. I mean, hell, I had somebody doing their work for them. And anyway, they produced this Constitution. But let's keep going. 1780, just before this, the General Assembly meeting in Richmond for the first time passed this law looking for new members of Virginia militia. Fighting for freedom, each recruit and also all our soldiers that have already enlisted shall receive a healthy, sound Negro between the ages of 10 and 30 years, moreover be entitled to 300 acres of land. So that's, if you fight for freedom in the American Revolution, that's what you get. So this is going on at the same time, in the same people, in the same hearts, in the same structure. Go ahead. But meanwhile, down the islands, things are getting a little bit hot. And let me tell you, everybody here knows it. The thing is, we don't know it because we hadn't studied history properly. But I'm just reading a book right now on the War of 1812, where the British Navy is going up and down the Chesapeake Bay into the different necks. And slaves are running to get on the British boats, and the fear of a slave rebellion is enormous, and it continues through this whole period. Well, why wouldn't it? Okay. Next. Thank you. Okay, yeah, well, it's just they burn plantations. People get killed in the islands. So you can imagine how it feels. And don't forget, these folks are coming up here as refugees and mixing in with the population. But got another one? Oh, here's Gabriel. It's pretty impressive thing that he tried to do. Go ahead. All right, I don't know what you can see on this. I'm so familiar with it. But this is, at Richmond Hill, which is at 22nd and Grace on Church Hill. It's a beautiful view of the city. And everybody knows that that's where, high school kids used to park at night and so on. So we're standing at the end of Grace Street. We're looking west. That's Grace Street right there. Those wagons in the street are from Seabrook's warehouse, which is just to the right in the picture. This is the Pace King House, the square house in the foreground, which is still there. Then there are trees, and right on the other side of the trees, and I may have another slide to show you, but don't put it up yet, is a big creek called Shackles Creek. And then there's Lumpkin Slave Jail. Now I want you to look at the wagons. Go right up here. That's the governor's mansion. That's his bedroom. So he looks right down at Lumpkin Slave Jail and the slave market. St. Paul, Capitol here, the old spire of St. Paul's here. And I think we'll see the Egyptian building over here, but oh, it's across the street. That's Broad Street on the far corner. Okay, next slide.
In the hospital.
So here's an Englishman who comes to town. He comes with William Makepeace Thackeray, who's a famous British author. He writes and he paints these paintings
Well, wait a minute. Let me just
of the slave market. Of course, they're exhibited in London, but not in Richmond.
You understand what extended release is?
Gosh,
You know, it's 24.
can't do it. Yeah, okay.
Anyway,
Slaves,
the doctor who was the hospital
slaves waiting for sale, as this is called.
formula
Next slide.
that
And slaves going south. He painted this picture in the market,
not, it
17th
doesn't
Street.
require
People in a
us.
coffle, in a wagon, also people in coffles. Go ahead.
Have to go back to the doctor that prescribed it originally.
Judgment of God, I don't know. Currier and Ives did this.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Is it Kathleen? 7:16.
We set fire to our own city.
PRO.
This is the site of Lumpkin Slave Jail in 1910. This is a steel factory, the steel factory on top of where the Lumpkin Slave Jail had been,
I don't have the
which we basically
it's just
dug through the foundations of this to get to the origins of Lumpkin Slave Jail. Go ahead. This is what happens to Shaco Valley in 1956. This is the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike is being built. Everybody recognize where we are. This is Broad Street coming up from the bottom. First African Church is right here. And DMV right there. February 16, 2006, we found Lumpkin Slave Jail. We found it underground, 10 feet underground. We found it partly in a parking lot and partly under the interstate. Very important moment. Go ahead. So here you can see it more clearly, and this is a current picture. There's I-95, there's Broad Street, there's the burial ground on the north side of the area east of the expressway. Here's where Lumpkin Slave Jail was excavated. Here is Main Street Station, right there. This is an enlargement of that photo I showed you earlier from Churchill, and you can see a building. That's Lumpkin Slave Jail. Go ahead. All right. So why is February 2006 important? Because for 135 years, the history of Richmond omitted the fact that we were the largest slave market in the East Coast of America. That 300,000 people minimum were sold from downtown Richmond to the Deep South in the period from about 1830 to 1860. That is 3 times as many Africans as were brought into Virginia in the African slave trade. African slave trade in Virginia was 114,000 people. Most of it in the other parts of the Tidewater, but from 1730 to 1774, the largest ingress of Africans came to Bermuda Hundred, which is Chesterfield County. If you know the geography, you know the James River is very wide till it gets to Bermuda Hundred. And then it splits into the Appomattox and the James as a much more narrow, curly stream coming up to Richmond. So at Bermuda 100. But here we discover that this slave trade has happened. We never even were taught about the downriver slave trade. Did you know there was a downriver slave trade? I didn't. Nobody I was working with in the city of Richmond did. The historians I was working with didn't. The black people I was working with didn't. Nobody seemed to know there was such a thing. But we discovered this jail definitely in 2006. Next slide, please. And we opened it up. And you're seeing here one of the pictures of the foundations that we found. What happened was the archaeologists looked down to a 48-inch square pit, and 10 feet below the surface of the parking lot there at 17th and Broad, there was this pristine cobblestone courtyard, just as if it was built yesterday. And it was, I mean, I can still see it. I'm like, are you kidding me? And then we went back, got another $500,000, and a couple of years later, I think 2008, we opened up the whole thing. Let's do a couple more slides of this. These are the foundations of the buildings of Lumpkin's. Lumpkin had the largest slave jail in the bottom, that there were 5 major ones in the bottom. The whole bottom, 50% of the entire economy of Richmond was dependent upon the sale of enslaved people. Let me say a little more about that, because I'm there often showing people around. You know, there's the myth of the happy slave, which is in Virginia textbooks through 1965, by the way, and educated us, the majority of the members of the General Assembly, till about 5 years ago. The myth of the happy slave is not without substance. That is to say, in 5 generations of enslaved people of Virginia plantations, not only was there genetic relationship that occurred between owners and enslaved people, but there were also social relationships, some sense of sometimes decency and friendship. I mean, this is all real, that occurs in this time. The 4th grade textbook in Virginia said that most slaves stayed with their owners in order to help them during the war because they wanted to make sure they were safe. That's what every child in Virginia was taught through the late 1960s. So you see this change in the last 50 years is what we're talking about. Between 1830 and 1860, it didn't matter who you were related to, who your kin were, who your mom was, whether you wanted to stay with the person you were married to, it didn't matter, you'd be sold. You'd be sold to the deep south, you'd be sold downriver, you'd be thrown into the cotton fields. And it's a very, very tormented life down there. If you will look at 12 Years a Slave, you'll see some of it. There were no relationships that were sacrosanct. Anything that had happened in the Middle Passage from Africa to America was duplicated in this period of time. It was horrendous, absolutely inexcusable. It was extremely traumatic. People were treated as commodities in a way that they had been earlier. And that's what happened in Virginia until 1865. And that's what was happening in this city. And that story was not told for the next 135 years, either by black people or white people. Black folks didn't tell it, my friends tell me, because they didn't want to saddle their kids with it. Just did not want them to have this to carry. And white people, you know, if you read the stuff, I'm doing St. Paul's history a lot from 1845 on when it starts. I mean, it's like living next to Auschwitz and not knowing it's there. Nobody talks about it. Nice people don't know about this. And, you know, Tom's my lawyer. You know, Tom, you know somebody who can help me get something out of that slave market down there. But, you know, I wouldn't even know that person. He's going to go through a couple people to get what needs to happen. We all know how that kind of stuff works. Well, it really was true here. The more the city moved from the, well, I follow Monumental Church, which decided to move en masse to St. Paul's in 1841. And part of the reason they're moving is the First African Church is opening up next door. And also they're on top of the slave market. So you cannot, I mean, I am still so stunned by this, I can hardly bear it. And I don't know how else to talk about it, except it needs to be known. We need to tell the truth, otherwise we can't do our work. Okay, next slide, please. We'll run through these. Some of the cobblestones. Next. Okay, here's the way the thing looked. I'm sorry the one on the right isn't as visible, but this is a reconstruction. The slave jail was down 14 feet below the surface at the moment. It's the wettest part of the city, it floods. And then he had a dormitory, a hotel for people who came to buy and sell. He had a kitchen where they produced food for everybody. He had his own mansion, which is actually under the interstate. But as you probably know, the year after the Civil War ended, a man named Culver, who was a missionary from New England, came down here looking for a place to start a school for free black people, ran into Mary Lumpkin, who was the high yellow wife of Robert Lumpkin, whom he had married after the war, at least had made sure her children got, I mean, I don't know this stuff. Culver rents Lumpkin Slave Jail for the school that becomes Virginia Union University. It's a pretty amazing reality. So, you know, if you're a Christian, you believe in the resurrection, you can figure out how this works. If you do some of this other spiritual stuff, you can still believe in the resurrection or the power of God to overcome, or the strange way in which human healing emerges out of the worst stuff. Next. So we're working to get a National Slavery Museum on top of Lumpkin Slave Jail. Reason is, it's the real thing. You know, it's down the hill from the governor's mansion, right? We got these guys planning this wonderful Republic of Freedom on the one hand, and we've got this other thing going on down here. It's almost unspeakably strange, but our nation and the world has to be fashioned out of this today. And this story of liberation, which is a pretty incredible story, the more you get into it, is the one we have to deal with. We want to put the National Slavery Museum on top of this because it's the real thing, because the bottom floor will be underground, protected from water, but visible to everybody to see. You can't lie about it. I grew up on lies. I grew up with hidden realities which I didn't know, but they were polluting the common life.
Well, you know, the theme in the history courses when you and I were in school, when all of us were in school, that at least in this part of the world, the Civil War was not even about slavery at all.
I know, it wasn't.
Only about states' rights.
Yeah, I know. It was just about us wanting to, you know, do our own thing. We're going to run 5 slides and I'm through. Go for this. This is pictures of, go ahead. Just keep going. Yeah. That's it, yeah. The group that's designed this is called the Smith Group. They're the people that did the Museum of African American History on the Mall, and they are currently doing an expansion for the VMFA. The expansion of the VMFA costs $200 million. This whole museum costs $200 million. And folks say we shouldn't spend it. So we just have a couple of signs out there for that half of our history. And meanwhile, keep the other half going strong. So I think this is important, and I think the scale of it is really important, so that we can do our work as a people and know what goes on. Fact is better than ideology. You know, the critical race theory fight is crazy, but not knowing what happened is not good. Okay, let's go on. All right, so what this is this is their idea of some of what the virtual reality stuff that can be done to recreate not Lumpkin slave jail as you see it on top of the, you'll actually, the excavated stuff will be there. But then you can also create a virtual reality picture of what it was when it was there. So that's just what they're playing with. I think that's Lumpkin's house. Yep. There we are. You can get these online. If you look up Lumpkin Slave Jail, I think you'll find these pictures. They won by the way, a state AIA award for this last year or the year before. Okay, I'm stopping. Those are my basically what you've got. What we have is a structured inequality that was built over was deliberately built over a 363-year period. Intentionally stated to be that way. And then you've pulled the names off it, but a lot of the structures of inequality still exist. The worst one being public education. Because the state is committed to segregated education at this point in time and has not done anything to prevent it. In fact, it's done everything it can to encourage it. And the problem is not simply racial segregation. The problem is the one that the initial folks fighting for integration wanted, which is decent education and equity for the kids who need it. Education is generationally cumulative. That's what we need to understand. So if you want the kids at Woodville to have a shot like the kids out at Short Pump, you've got to spend twice as much money for the kids at Woodville. You cannot simply demand that they pass tests. Otherwise, you destroy their education. This testing system in many ways has destroyed the education of inner city schools. And my wife's a teacher, so I live with that day in and day out.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very stimulating.
I'm glad I was stimulating.
Could you please define critical race theory and put it in its current context?
I can't, because I'd have to give it to my daughter, who's a professor at American U. But it deals with a way of approaching the generic topics of race. And as I've listened to it, it makes no sense to me. It makes a lot of sense to her. I'm not interested in theory. I'm simply interested in telling the truth because I think that's what God deals with. I mean, I think honestly, and the thing about truth and fact is that it has an impersonal quality to it. We have to deal with it. Critical race theory argument is about whether we should view how you would view the period of the start of America as being basically with inequality based into it. And I think that a lot of that is true. But my wife's a third grade teacher. I know what she did with an integrated classroom, how the children, looked at reality without having some sense of division fought into their classroom, how the white kids wanted to be the black heroes and the black kids wanted to be the white heroes, how the work was done with story rather than with ideology. And as I said, I'm sorry, I'd have to get Susanna down here to do that one for you. Thank you for asking.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
There's a chat question. What grants and fundraisers for the Slave Museum are being sought, and any good chances in any other fundraising going on?
The money to start the nonprofit foundation that will do the fundraising was voted by the City Council 2 nights ago, or 4 nights ago. So most of the money to date has been spent out of Richmond City Capital Funds, and the state of Virginia has given us about $15 million to get the next phase of fundraising stuff going. What's got to happen for the big money is you got to get your full business plan in place and full indication of revenue streams for maintenance of the facility. And that actually is the Smith Group's next 9-month process.
I just want to make a comment. I have a client whose niece was almost trafficked, and there was a arrest on the corner of West Broad and Glenside because there's a hotel. Yeah, that was a couple of years ago where they found a bunch of people in the room with soundproofed. And I have a social work colleague who lives in El Paso, and they have.
Water.
That's okay.
As long as it didn't hit the machine,
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
just leave it. It'll be fine. But she's a social worker in El Paso, and she works with a lot of the children that are trafficked by the coyotes. They come back and forth, and they actually recycle the children, and they come back and forth. And so I'm just and I think about Roman history and medieval history, and I think about human trafficking has been, in slavery is an integral part of human history. So I think it's really important. I really think this is super cool. I don't know if we can add a GoFundMe to your or if you have a Facebook presence or something like that. But that would be. I hope that this gets built.
I think you'll probably have an opportunity to at least get on in fact, I'll put you on a mailing list if you want to do that.
Cool.
For what happens next on the Slavery Museum. If you want to pass it around, give me emails.
Yeah.
It'll be my own, and I'll only put on it stuff that I want to put on it. Which means probably no more than once every 2 months. But what's so important to understand about Virginia, though, is that enslavement was the law here. And even people, and this is something to look at sometime, Tom, is that free black was not free. 20%. Between 10 and 20% of African Americans in Richmond's always been half black and half white, by the way, from 1770. But about 20% were free, but that's not free. They could come into your house anytime you wanted. You couldn't vote. As you know, in the Virginia Constitution, after they were trying to prevent you from voting, even when the feds said you could vote. You couldn't buy property significantly. You could a little, and a few people did, but remember redlining in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s was all about preventing people. When I moved to Churchill was redlined. How do I know? I tried to get a mortgage. Me, a white boy with 3 degrees, working for the Episcopal Bishop of Virginia. I tried to get a mortgage. No bank in town would look at it. That's 1974. I went to the bishop and I said, look, you want me to work here or not? He said, yeah, I want you to work here. So he called up the head of one of his investment boards, and they gave me a $10,000 line of credit. That was it. That was the limit. So I went and did a study on redlining in Richmond and published it and nailed them.
Tim Kaine had a
Nobody on Zoom is here.
Our Senator Tim, are we on yet? Are we on this? Okay. Our Senator Tim Kaine, who just spent 27 hours driving from Richmond to Washington last week, had his law back before he was governor in the 90s, had a suit against Nationwide for redlining.
For redlining insurance companies.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the one that got a $100 million punitive damages award. Of course, the cap in Virginia is $350,000.
Is that right?
Right, right. But it looked good on paper anyway.
Yeah. More questions, thoughts?
Is this, okay, we're on. Ben, other than the museum, I know you have many, you're a visionary, you have many visions about other things that could be done to create a greater situation of equity and so forth. Can you expound on some of those ideas of yours?
Well, honestly, the best thing that could happen I hate to say this, but would be a metropolitan government in Richmond. The only thing that offsets capitalism is a healthy tax structure, so that what Adam Smith wanted to happen is what happens, which is when the wealthy benefit, everybody else benefits. And that's what Smith saw. He was a moral theologian. That's what he saw in the town he was working in. And he said, you know, there's nothing wrong with the way the capitalist structure works, although it does have inequitable incomes. Everybody benefits when everybody benefits. But what we've done in this country, and Virginia, it's fascinating. As long as we were able to maintain this legally reinforced racial hierarchy, we were able to have cities that could expand. But when we could no longer do that legally by putting race into law, what we had to do was what the North had done the previous 80 years, which was to fragment their cities in separate jurisdictions. So Philadelphia has 300 jurisdictions. You know, you basically can live in a town of 15,000 people that has, as its recreation center, the local country club. And your schools can be segregated to people just like you and your income level. So you can do that. That's been done all over the country. It didn't have to be done here until it was invented in the early 70s in order to replace the previous system of segregation. But I look at education a lot. That's what I've worked in for years. And you know, if you want to really, the number one reparation thing we ought to be doing is education. And here's the deal. Pass a law that says the state will pay all education, public education expenses, not 45% or 55% that they do now. Secondly, pass a law that says that education money will be distributed on a formula that gives twice as much money, 200%, to the poorest. So the bottom 50% in terms of income, which is a stand-in for race, that the bottom 50% will get, you know, the lowest part of those will get 50% more, part of them will get 100% more. That goes to the system. So when I'm dealing at Armstrong, where I dealt for 15 years, you know, 99% black, 99% impoverished, 60% traumatically affected before they get to high school. When I'm dealing, it's 5 public housing projects in one school. When I'm dealing at Armstrong, and 3rd lowest in the state in test scores. When I'm dealing at Armstrong, basically I'm dealing with 200% of the budget to deal with the children. Then pass a state real estate tax that pays for this. That's what you got to do. Now that would actually mean that we were serious about overcoming inequity. We are not serious about overcoming inequity. It's not our intent. There's been nothing that has made that true in Virginia law. All we've done is try to take away the barriers to continued intensification of it by getting rid of the racial stuff in law. And that's good, but, and we've got some real steps forward. So the other thing, you know, transportation's one. You talk about structural inequity. Every time the state builds a highway in a major metropolitan area and does not provide public transportation on it, it basically is determining that 20% of the population will not have access. No other country in the world does that. But that's a racial decision masked by an economic decision. And you know, if it were me, I'd require public transportation on anything the state does that justifies it. And of course, what that would do is build healthier cities, because development would occur on public transportation lines and not simply sprawled out further and further. So that, you know, once you do this, once we deal with the issue of tax inequity and public facility inequity, we've done the best stuff we can do. Democracy, I mean, Glenn Youngkin is being inaugurated today as governor. Not my choice, but he's governor of the state. And the business that we're in is putting conflict into a democratic process. That's important. That's what we do. That's what you do if you would create some metropolitan government. We have a new thing called the Central Virginia Transportation Authority that I am dealing with, which is really the first real hazard of metropolitan government that we've got, where there's state money coming from a sales tax that's going to be used for transportation that has to be divvied up by these 9 jurisdictions in the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. 15% of it goes to public transit, which is not enough at all. Basically will not give us much money for remedying it. Richmond, by the way, has one of the lowest footprints of public transit of any city its size in the world. And 75% of our jobs are inaccessible by public transit. So that's not the city. Center City, that is Richmond, 62 square miles out of the 1,200. Center City has good coverage, but everything else is crazy.
We've had everybody muted on Zoom. I'm going to ask Zoom people if they have any questions. If you have any questions, put your hand up, or your reaction hand up, or unmute yourself so I can see you.
Okay.
Okay, Lindley Smith has a question. Let me unmute Lindley. Go ahead, Lindley.
I really don't have it. I just met Doctor. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little funky, but talk slow.
I'm just saying, I have a question. I want to commend Dr. Campbell on his presentation. We're really, I can really appreciate the education given us.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Our biggest issue, one of our biggest issues right now is housing. And we saw it in the pandemic. But when I'm giving you those numbers, because I know the numbers, and when I tell you that $45,000 is barely enough to have a healthy income in life and pay your rent, so that means that a person earning $45,000 or a household is actually 1 or 2 months away from eviction. And the cost, I ran a nonprofit doing housing for a while, so I got mine. But the cost of building 1,200 square feet is about $200,000 right now. And that means that a mortgage for that is what, you have to have an income of about 55. So that's how difficult it is for us to do the economics of this housing thing. And what we know is, another statistic which is terrifying right now is that, and these statistics vary from the source of them. So I will tell you, I'll just give you one set. One set says that the median wealth of black families in America is $17,000. And the median wealth of white families is $170,000. Really, the statistics will vary on who's telling them. Some do 5,000 and 120,000. But basically, it's where the capital is. Remember, this whole system was based on the assumption at the beginning that certain people distinguished by race shall be property rather than own property. That's how Virginia starts. And it goes through 1865. So that's 260 years that's going on. And then we have this period where basically white people are paid enough and allowed to own property, but black people are not. And that's done by race. And that goes through 1970 or so. Now we're in this period where we've had some change. One of the big problems of Richmond is the flight of the black middle class means that basically Richmond is gentrifying whites and poor black folks as a city. And surrounding it are the new suburbs, where this generation of black leadership lives in the suburbs, but doesn't have a majority. So it's neither controlling suburban life nor able to contribute as strongly to city life as it could before. Yes.
We moved here from Charlottesville 3 years ago.
Bless your heart.
And we really wanted to live in a mixed neighborhood. So we are the guilty gentrifiers of 35th Street. We live right next door to a black family who's been there for 3 generations, who take great pride in the fact that they have home ownership. I don't know how the tax system works in the city, but because we are in a 1920 house that was totally renovated, the developers or the renovators applied for tax forgiveness. So we have this wonderful experience of having our taxes at least reduced for something like 10 years. Mm-hmm. The people next to us have their taxes going up all the time. The black family, I think this is how this works. They don't have that forgiveness, and they have been punished because now we are living in a neighborhood where, you know, $500,000 is what the house across the corner, on the corner, sold for. They have taken great pride in the fact of their home ownership, and they're very committed to staying there. And it seems to me that those folks in Churchill, like them, are being pushed out because they can't afford the rising taxes that we bring with us.
Yeah, that is true of some people. And it's, I mean, I bought a house in Churchill for $6,000 and sold it last year for something like $450,000. There is a tax relief for people 62 and older, which does cut real estate tax to try to enable people to stay in their houses. That program that you're talking about that enabled you to buy a house, a shell, and then renovate it with no tax on the renovation amount for a period of time, was set up when they were trying to encourage renovation in Churchill 40 years ago, and it should be gone. It should not be there. Ellen Robertson, who works on taxes on City Council, and others have been trying to get rid of it for exactly the reason you're saying. It's a tax benefit to the privileged. We don't need it. In fact, I worked for 10 years to try to prevent gentrification in Churchill, and it actually didn't go real heavy until about 2000 when the hobbyists moved in and started buying and flipping houses. But it went fast, and you're living in the part where it did go fast. But thanks. I lived in Churchill for 45 years. I love it. I'm glad you get to be there. It's a good place. Painful though. Richmond has the 6th largest concentration of public housing of any city in the country. 5 public housing projects were put in Churchill on purpose. And they actually intended, and we were able to stop it, they intended to run the Martin Luther King Bridge straight through to I-64. They wanted to have a 6-lane expressway from the end of the Martin Luther King Bridge to I-64, and that would have completely surrounded the area in which the 5 public housing projects were. And then at the bottom of the hill is the city jail. That was the plan of the 50s. I mean, you wanted the other, I didn't do the 50s for you, but the 50s are amazing here. From 1950 to 1970, every black neighborhood in town is torn down. And they decide to build an 18-block long ditch through Jackson Ward, which is the oldest black neighborhood in town, when there's a natural valley 4 blocks away. Still there, that valley's still there. Go look at it. It's wide enough for, 15 lanes of highway. It's got 1 railroad track going down it. And it was the natural route for the road, but instead they chose to destroy the neighborhood. And they did that to every other black neighborhood in town. It is a strange, strange history. Mm-hmm.
This one is about schools because we read the Free Press for news of what's happening in Richmond. And I read that Winsome Sears, who's now a lieutenant governor, is all in favor of charter schools. And we also live down the street on M Street. There's a brand new, beautiful elementary school.
Yeah,
that's
George
been
Mason,
built.
Henry Marsh Elementary.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful.
This seems to me very underused because we get this brochure or a booklet every year about all of the private schools that there are that you can send your children to in Richmond. So I'm wondering how it is that we make education, good education, available to the black kids who are in the neighborhood when the government of Virginia is now proactively encouraging more charter schools.
Well, George Mason's not underutilized. Henry Marsh School, it's fully occupied, or will be when the COVID's over. And it's a wonderful addition, named for one of the great men of Richmond's history in this last century. As I said, my wife taught in Richmond Public Schools for 35 years, and I sent 4 kids through Richmond Public Schools and have worked with them, most recently with Armstrong for 15 years. the state doesn't want them to succeed. I mean, it's when you concentrate poverty at this level and create classrooms of traumatized children, basically you're doing that to try to push kids away from other schools. That's why you're doing it. And you end up with a system that is deeply impoverished and concentrated. And the data on it is very clear what happens when you do that. And the only answer to it is small classes, wraparound services, full year work. I know how to do it. Private schools do it, charter schools do it. Everybody knows how to do it, but you have to have the resources and intent to do it. And the state doesn't care. The state basically gives more money per child to a student in Chesterfield County than it does to a student in Richmond. I mean, it is absolutely shameful. And the Republicans in Virginia have been taking money from large private charter school companies for the last 15 years. The largest one being the K-12 company, which is in Northern Virginia, and they've been pouring money into the Republican campaigns. What charter schools do, I mean, everybody knows this. The number one selector for success in children in a highly concentrated, impoverished minority environment, the number one criterion for success is the desire to learn. That's the desire to show up. It means to come to school, it means to go to class when you're in school, and it means to pay attention to what's happening in the classroom when you're in the classroom. That's the selector. So when we're at Armstrong, and I've worked with a program there that graduated 100% of its students, sent them either to further education or to jobs. When we're at Armstrong, that selects who succeeds. That's what every charter school gets, is somebody wanting to be there or having a parent want them to be there. And that's what every private school gets, which is somebody wanting to be there. The children who need the help are the children who are so traumatized that they can't function. And what happens in a trauma, if you want to read more about this, there's a thing called the ACTS survey, Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs survey, which tells you about how this works. But when children coming out of highly intense environments, a high percentage of them are suffering from severe trauma. They create an alternate culture, which is an avoidance culture. It's an emotional avoidance culture. It doesn't work in the classroom. And if you put 20 kids with that level of trauma in a classroom, the teacher can't run the classroom. So you have to have a smaller class. You have to have real serious, I know the kids I work with, we're pretty sure that 60 to 70% of the kids we work with in Armstrong would profit from personal counseling. No resources. How would you do that? The state doesn't care. So those are the things we know. And since all the state does is impose standards on inner city schools, thinking, I guess, that we're not working hard enough, it's abusive. I mean, it reminds me of whipping people, and it is not helpful. So of course, what the state does and what the newspapers do is they blame the city. Whereas the city basically is powerless. It's putting more money into education from its own taxes than any of the localities around. But the decision is made in the General Assembly and at the governor's office. And it is absolutely dastardly. So that's what I have to say about it. I love it. I've been working with it for years. I love the children. It's ridiculous.
Ben, am I on here? Okay. One thing that comes to my mind in listening to your very, very eloquent presentation is that in terms of things like Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and laissez-faire capitalism and all that, that our drive to separate different groups of humans into silos, if you will, some of which are more equal than others, like an animal farm. This perhaps is a major contributor to the gross inequities of the economic situation and to the institutions we have created across not only the state of Virginia, but across the whole United States, where we have developed any number of institutional realities that are non-sustainable for any period of time. Our healthcare system is one, our educational system is another, our inequities of economics is another. If everything were not looked at from the standpoint of there not being enough to go around, and of there being an economic system based on the premise of scarcity, then there would be no need for these kinds of class divisions, these kinds of economic divisions, and so forth. But it seems to me that a large part of, and perhaps this is the reason why the United States has less social mobility and less economic mobility than most any other industrialized democratic nation in the Western world, despite our aspirations to be so full of opportunity. It's structurally prevented by the systems we've created, and so this is writ large through the presentation you've given today.
One of the funny things about capitalism is deciding whether you're talking about empiricism or an ideology.
Right.
Empirically, it's a pretty good description of how stuff gets built and makes stuff to happen. As an ideology, it stinks. Selfishness is not a virtue.
Right.
It's something you can take advantage of for the health of a society. The question is not whether or not empirically economics works through capital. It does. The question is what kind of capitalism? And that's the problem that we've not really been able to be honest about. So what we've done is to, I love Galbraith's stuff. 50 years ago, Galbraith said we underspend in the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
He's not talking about giving out doles. He's talking about making sure you have good public education, good recreation facilities, good public transport. Then if you have to pay somebody $25,000 a year, at least they can have a life. I'm head of the board of GRTC. That's what I know. During the pandemic, GRTC was one of the few bus systems in the country that maintained almost 100% of its ridership and its normal ridership, not the Pulse or the commuter buses from Henrico. But we maintained a higher percentage of our ridership than most systems in the country, and we're now back up above what we had before the pandemic. It was only essential riders. 50% of our riders have household incomes of $25,000 a year or less. So those were the people who were keeping the society going.
Mm-hmm. Really?
And 75% of our riders have $50,000 a year or less in household income. So these are the people keeping the society going. And they're dependent upon healthy public facilities so that life then works. I got to make it work. And we've just been so stupid about this as a culture and allowed ourselves to really get out of control.
I read a statistic in the last 6 months or so that indicated a projection that by 2030, the Richmond metropolitan area would have increased from 1.3 million to around 2 million.
I've never seen that one.
I don't know whether it was accurate or not, but part of that projection was that 30% of that 2 million people would be of Latin American origin. And that seems like a very high percentage, But it also would indicate that the issues that have been problematic in the city of Richmond, inside the city limits, will then be visited upon the surrounding counties of Chesterfield and Henrico.
Well, the spread of poverty and the spread of racial diversity is significant. Henrico is a majority-minority county at the moment. Now, a significant percentage of those are Asians who have a lot of money and live in the West End. But the problem is this permitting people of so my brother-in-law, I love him to death. His politics kind of drive me crazy. So he bought a house in Haymarket. You remember Haymarket. Haymarket didn't used to be anything, but this is in a restricted community on a 4-lane highway that the state built. The country club is the recreation center. And he's a really smart guy, and he actually worked in Anacostia part of his life. He's had an interesting life. But he said to me, and I'm sure his house probably cost, I'm not sure, his house almost certainly cost $1 million, as did everything else on his street. And he said to me the other day that he really didn't think racism was a problem. And what that means is he's probably got a black friend who lives down the street. But what he's done is, and what the county has allowed him to do, and what the state has allowed him to do, is to take his money, put it with other people's money, and roll it up in a package where there will be a public school nearby just for their children. You can just see the pattern. And that it's that isolation thing by race and income that is basically our current issue for health as a society. And it is a big problem.
And the current version of the issue that you state so eloquently started back in 1619.
That's right. Actually, 1607, when we acted like Jesus wanted us to steal somebody else's land.
Right.
And didn't count them as having any rights.
Right.
So you're assuming a culture that doesn't start from the premise of human right.
Right. Ben, we're out of time now, but I just want to thank you. This has been an absolutely wonderful, wonderful presentation. And we're so grateful. You lived up to the billing I gave you, and then some. So thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
It's a wonderful way to celebrate our 26th anniversary. The water on the floor was a small price to pay for the presentation you gave. Everyone, I'd like to thank you for joining us. And next month, what do we have next month? We have Elena Mustakova next month, who is going to just recently published a new book called Global Unity of Healing, and she has been a speaker for us a couple of times in the past. She is a clinical psychologist from Northern Virginia, actually from Bulgaria, and is spending about half her time in Bulgaria these days. But she's an absolutely wonderful speaker, and invite you all to join us here in person and/or on Zoom for next month's presentation. It's going to be a great one, just like the one today was. Thank you so much, and welcome to the beginning of our 27th year. What are you pointing to, Carol?
Martha. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but anyway, there's little cupcakes if people want to have a cupcake.
For those who are here, we have some cupcakes out by the coffee, and invite all of you to partake in them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and we'll see you next month.
How they gonna turn it off? Did you
I-
mute it off or?
I just turned it on.
All right, so I'm going to end the Zoom meeting for everybody. I'll see you all next month.